computer. Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm Ken Nabb, and as you probably know, we're in the middle of a discussion of my new book, The Joy of Revolution, and other related texts. And we're in the first two meetings, we looked at chapters 1, 2, and 3, which were about the pros and cons of various radical tactics, electoral politics, nonviolence, violence, reforms, different kind of things like that, and which sorts of things worked or did not work. And for this meeting, we're going to look at the last chapter of The Joy of Revolution, that text. We have some other things in the book that we'll get to later. And the last chapter is different than the first three in that it's like literally after the revolution. It's like we've previously talked about these strategies and tactics that might bring about a revolution of one kind or another. And now, at the end of the book, I'm saying, okay, we're done with that now. Let us just suppose as a thought experiment that we have won these things that people have been striving for centuries and so on, that for in one way or another, we managed to overthrow the system. We don't have to worry about an army invading to crush us or police to shoot us down or various things like that. And that we're kind of so we're sort of up in the air, like now let's say that we've dealt with that. So now what? And so the rest of the chapter is like, okay, what might people do in that circumstance? And part of it is what might they do right away? Like when we're still looking around at the same world that we have, it's just that now suddenly everybody's in control of it instead of a few billionaires. So then we're thinking about transitions. What do we do with the city? What do we do about how do we organize things if we have jettisoned the bureaucrats and politicians and capitalists and so on? So I'm going to first of all just read the chapter titles for this last, the sub chapters, just to see what we're doing. First one is Utopians fail to envision post-revolutionary diversity. And there I'm talking about that part of what I think might happen is that we don't just have one style of society. We have a variety of different styles, but that they would all have been sort of post-capitalist and post-state and so on. And then I go into decentralization and coordination. Like, do you want to centralize everything, decentralize everything? Obviously, you have a mixture. And what are the factors there? Then safeguards against abuses. Like, what do you do to prevent somebody from re-bureaucratizing the things like the Bolshevik Party did after the 1917 revolution, for example? What do you do to keep account of these people if you elect somebody to do something like a delegate? And then consensus, majority rule, and unavoidable hierarchies. So again, different ways that you might govern things or make decisions, popular decisions. Then eliminating the roots of war and crime. Like, what would you do if you, to prevent there from being wars, or to prevent, how would you deal with problematic behaviors or something if you didn't have police and jails and stuff like that? Then abolishing money, which is just one way of saying abolishing the commodity system, but it's kind of a simpler way to figure that out. And then the absurdity of most present day labor, like one reason that you can abolish money is that if you look at most of the labor that is done these days, it doesn't need to be done. It's either useless or worse than useless, like making wars and so on. Transforming work into play. Technophobic objections, like people who say we shouldn't use technologies and so on. Ecological issues, that's kind of an overlapping thing. The blossoming of free communities. And finally, more interesting problems, like sort of where do we go from there? So I'm just going to read a little part of the very first subchapter about diversity and utopians, and then we can start some Q&A and so on. Utopian speculations can help free us from the habit of taking the status quo for granted, get us thinking about what we really want and what might be possible. What makes them utopian in the pejorative sense that Marx and Engels criticized is the failure to take present conditions into consideration. There is usually no serious notion of how we might get from here to there. Ignoring the system's repressive and cooperative powers, utopian authors generally envision some simplistic, cumulative change, imagining that with the spread of utopian communities or utopian ideas, more and more people will be inspired to join in, and the old system will simply collapse. And as is pretty obvious, it doesn't happen that way. But often when you do see these things, they're like, well, if only everybody would just be unselfish, or if everybody would be peaceful, then we wouldn't have this. And yeah, that's true, if only, but that's not going to happen because somebody says, if only. It's going to happen. Other factors have to enter in there. So I say, I hope the present text, that is what we've just been reading, has given some more realistic ideas of how a new society might come about. In any case, at this point, I'm going to jump ahead and do a little speculating myself. To simplify matters, let us assume that a victorious revolution has spread throughout the world without too much destruction of basic infrastructures, so that we no longer need to take into consideration problems of civil war, threats of outside intervention, the confusions of disinformation, or the delays of massive emergency reconstruction, and can examine some of the issues that might come up in a new, fundamentally transformed society. And then say, far from being too extravagant, most fictional utopias are too narrow, generally being limited to a monolithic implementation of the author's pet ideas. As Marie-Louise Berneri notes in the best survey of the field, Journey Through Utopia, which we're going to be reading next year, all utopias are, of course, the expression of personal preferences. She's talking about written utopias. But their authors usually have the conceit to assume that their personal tastes should be enacted into laws. If they are early risers, the whole of their imaginary community will have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. If they dislike women's makeup, to use it is made a crime. If they are jealous husbands, infidelity will be punished by death, end quote. So I respond to this. If there is one thing that can be confidently predicted about the new society, it's that it will be far more diverse than any one person's imagination or any possible description. Different communities will reflect every sort of taste, aesthetic and scientific, mystical and rationalist, high-tech and neo-primitive, solitary and communal, industrious and lazy, Spartan and Epicurean, traditional and experimental, continually evolving in all sorts of new and unforeseeable combinations. So that's the end of that subchapter. And I think I'll pause here. Uh, that's leading into all the rest of the chapter assumes this kind of thing we're talking about here. So we're not going to be talking about what if somebody bribes somebody, because there's nothing to be bribed with, and so on. So I think I'll open it up for Q&A or comments. If you want to comment or question, please raise your digital hand, and that way I'll see you at the top of the thing here. Mike, please unmute yourself.
Okay. I just want to say one thing, that I am in basic agreement with everything you've written here, in this piece. But a point of information about what your first two paragraphs indicate that Marx and Engels basically, I mean, you sort of intimate that they had no vision for the future, but I've collected a bunch of their visions of the future in a Substack post that I've linked in the chat, and it they and as far as tactics go, one of the things that I that really opened my eyes back in the early 70s was Marx's speech called Value, Price, and Profit, where, I mean, just to give an example, one of the things he does is he explains how the political economy works and how commodity production, blah, blah, woof, woof, works, and how basically workers are turned into wage slaves. So he does offer the advice to the people that are sitting in the room that they should inscribe, that unions should inscribe on their banner, abolition of the wage system, which of course the IWW did. But that said, I congratulate you and on your bravery of coming up with a positive a positive view of what was going to happen in the future, because the way things are going, everybody's talking about dystopia all the time.
Yeah, it's
It's sort of
true.
depressing. And if you say anything positive, they say they jump on your case and say, "Ah, we just have to wait. We just have to all sit back and just wait for the Earth to fry, and humanity should all die." Blah blah woof woof. Okay. Anyway,
Uh,
I'll shut up for the whole session now. Thanks.
okay. Thanks for I haven't seen your link, but I look forward to the link. Yeah, I'm not implying that Marx and Engels did not uh, have some ideas about the future. But I think, as Marx said in in that thing that I did quote, he compared with many other social thinkers, he didn't have this whole vision of, oh, it's going to be like this, and it has to be like this, or this won't work, and all that. He was
Right. I
much
understand. I
going for
understand.
the minimum. I mean, if he was talking about we have to abolish wage labor, that's because that's a minimum.
Right.
It's not because he desired that, or that would be a nice thing. It's that
Right.
it needs to be done, and it can be done. He's not
Right.
even saying that it will be done, but it's just like,
Right.
well, it's a possible thing. And so I was just contrasting that with utopians who often invent these nice societies, like the
I
ones
I
we'll be
I
looking at.
realize that.
Yeah.
I realize that. I just wanted to put that on record. That's all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay. I'm just going to keep moving through here because we've got about a dozen subchapters to cover. So the next chapter, actually, I'm
And Judy had her
oh, Judy.
physical hand up, but not a
Okay.
Yeah,
digital
sorry, I
hand.
couldn't get my. Yeah, I was just wondering, you start out the chapter with the thing about human nature.
Yes.
And I just was wondering, because I never thought about human nature changing that much. I don't know I know people argue about it, but you're arguing that it does change.
Oscar Wilde is arguing that it does
Oscar
change.
Wilde is saying it does change.
Yeah.
So what is that? Do you think it does change? I mean,
Sure, sure. People are very flexible. You know, humans are capable of anything. I mean, they can invent new tortures and stuff like that, and they can invent new spiritual visions and invent new ways to help people. I mean, you name it, you know, and a lot of times the things that cause them to shift one way or the other uh, are kind of unexpected, you know, like if a little thing happened at some point in their life might have been turned around. You know, if somebody did something nice to them at a certain point, that maybe they remembered that the rest of their life and decided to devote their life to doing good things. And if somebody hit them over the head at some point, they'd spend the rest of their life trying to get even with everybody, you know. So, yeah, you know,
so you don't really believe in human nature as a fixed and
no, 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 no. Yeah, humans are so capable of so many things. You know, and particularly if you look at people in a rather miserable, stupid social organization where they're just oppressed all the time, it's not at all astonishing that they would be either complete dullards that are just sort of like vegetables or something, or that they would be nasty people trying to get back at all the people that have hurt them or something, and getting back at the people who didn't hurt them because they can't, you know, just thinking about people who want to get back at the immigrants or the Jews or the black people or whoever the scapegoat is that often doesn't even have anything to do with it, just because it's the only way, you know, they've been, uh, you know, injured, hurt in all kinds of ways, and they just react naturally. One of the May 68 graffiti was uh, people are, let's see, I wish, it's something like people are neither the, yeah, it's like man is neither Rousseau's noble savage, which is one view, like humans are naturally good and all this, nor the church's original sin, you know, like man is basically fucked up. You know, he says he is uh gentle when treated nicely or something like that. I'm paraphrasing this, and violent when treated badly. And that's what would you expect? I mean, any animal has the same reaction. So we can't look around us and say, oh, humans are like that, you know, blah, blah, blah. Because there's, you know, they go all sorts of different directions. And the main contention, when I get to my last chapter or some of these other here, is it's not to say that like some people do, like, oh, once we get over capitalism, everybody's going to be nice and it's going to be great. And that's not necessarily the case. The point is, we're getting beyond some completely absurd and unnecessary conditions that we're in now, which almost forces people to become mean and petty and competitive, you know, want to kill off everybody as rivals and all that. Whereas when we get over that, yeah, then we can still see maybe some people are still sort of ornery or you know, whatever. But we can deal with that without it, you know, like in our present brilliant society, we've got somebody like that with his finger on the nuclear bombs, you know, like uh Paul.
Hi.
uh,
Yeah, on the subject of Oscar Wilde, I haven't read the book on socialism, but I seem to recall reading somewhere a line attributed to him, which was that the problem with socialism is that it takes up too much of one's evenings. So that's it.
Uh-huh. Danny.
Here's a comment from the chat. Ken, just a brief recap here. A revolution that doesn't aim at getting rid of the state, money in the commodity system, wage labor, political parties, bureaucracy, and unions as we know them as mere reformists won't do. This is the bare minimum, right? Not an easy task.
Right. John M. Unmute yourself, please. Yeah.
Yeah, so just a quick comment. When speaking of human nature, then it made me think of, well, what about animal nature? We are an animal, and I think to some extent we're hardwired from that biological uh, thing. I mean, I think of the book going way back, The Naked Ape. I don't know what the content was, but just that point of considering uh, what you almost might call primal urges that come from being an animal more than human nature, which comes. Uh, Human nature seems kind of tricky because at some point it seems like human nature becomes
Becomes what?
refined through education,
Yeah,
or
yeah. I was going to
yeah,
say, like, culture is something
yeah,
that probably most, if not all, other animals don't have, at least in the way that we do. So we can assume that, I mean, maybe a baby, of 3 months or something, it's kind of irrelevant to say, does this little creature have an inherent thing to be violent because it gets frustrated, or is it, we can obviously see the potentials, like it it could be mad if somebody takes away its toy. And on the other hand, it can be really excited if somebody talks with it and plays with it. We see a lot of different possibilities there, but most of those, are with education, culture, socializing, all this kind of thing. We've seen that cultures can create all sorts of different kinds of people. I mean, there are cultures that are really kind of gloomy, and there are cultures that seem, pretty live and let live, happy-go-lucky, and everything in between. And so it's just like that book that you mentioned, The Naked Ape or whatever it was. I mean, that one is notoriously written by this guy who's sort of playing into the, like the right-wing capitalist thing, like, oh, man is this way, and so just suck it up. That's how it is, and that's just not the case. I mean, we have many societies are not like that, uh, and it just varies a lot depending on what kind of background, that people have. So if people don't have to fight each other for food or to, drive away a tribe that's invading your hunting ground or something like that, then there are other things a lot more interesting to do. So, um, So I'm going to just move on here, but feel free to raise your digital hand at any point, and I can stop and we can pick up here. So the next subchapter is decentralization and coordination, and I'm not even going to go into that. I just deal with things about, how would things be organized, and the point there is that some things can be best organized centrally, and other things can be best organized decentralized. And so we don't even have to make a rule about this. Like some anarchists often say, decentralization, good. Well, it depends. Sometimes decentralization enables authoritarian stuff because it's not very workable. And in other kinds of things, obviously, centralization can be handy. You don't want to have everybody have to have the same thing in their backyard, you know, when you can, all that. So anyway, I go into that a little bit. And the next one, safeguards against abuses. Again, I just talk about what I think are fairly obvious things, like if you have alternate ways of making public decisions besides electing a government that you then don't have much control over. There are different ways to deal with that, you know, like you still may elect certain people for certain tasks. Everybody doesn't have to do everything all at once. So anyway, I just give examples of that. And the next chapter is kind of the same thing: consensus, majority rule, and unavoidable hierarchies. And the gist of that, I give this quotation from William Morris's News from Nowhere, which we're also going to be reading next year, A Delightful Utopia, about how they make decisions in that land. And then here's something. So there's all these different ways that people can make sort of collective democratic decisions with various nuances of control or checking, or, you know, etc. But I point out, like, as sort of a basic outline, during May 68, when the workers had occupied all the factories of France pretty much, at the high point of that, the situationists and their other comrades put out this leaflet called Address to All Workers. And in that address, they're saying, hey, you've done this great thing. This is fantastic. We've made France dance. You know, we've scared all the bureaucrats and capitalists around the world and all that. Where from now? And basically, they're saying, you have some options there, folks. And this is up to you. It's not just up to a few people that you elect or whatever to decide. And then they lay out like what they envision as the basic things. They're calling for these workers to form workers' councils, which is a democratic, participatory kind of organization that was first invented in Russia in 1905, and that we saw a lot in the Spanish Revolution, for example. And so they say, here are the essential features of such councils. Dissolution of all external power. In other words, you can't have councils and also have a state, or also have a police force, or also have some political parties. The whole point about the councils is that everybody is engaged and there's no outside power. So you don't even have to worry about, well, what if President so-and-so says this or whatever. Direct and total democracy. Self-explanatory. Practical unification of decision and execution. In other words, you don't have those things divided, like where certain people elect somebody and then the person who's supposed to implement the decision is separate and has a separate power. The idea is that the implementation of the decisions should be integrally interlinked with the people that make those decisions. In other words, the populace. Delegates who can be revoked at any moment by those who have mandated them. Delegates are what replaces representatives. Like in normal politics under our society, people elect representatives, and then the representatives go off to Washington or wherever, and they're there for 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, and they're doing all kinds of things with all kinds of laws that nobody who elected them even knew about. or even if people elected them with under the impression that these people would do good things, they couldn't, they're just, they're kind of trusting that this one individual out of 100,000 people is going to honestly do a good job and blah, blah, blah. And basically, everybody else just sort of has to hope that they'll do it, both that they're honest and that they're not stupid, that they're intelligent enough to follow through, and et cetera. And so that's the existing thing. Delegates are what you do when you want to avoid that state kind of situation. You can have a large group of workers, or anybody for that matter, just people in a neighborhood or city or whatever, who elect somebody for a purpose. They say, okay, we want to change that building there, tear it down and put something else up, or we want to investigate how best to do this. I mean, any number of things that they could decide, and they might decide for that purpose, we need to compare notes with people in these neighboring cities or neighboring regions or something, and come up with some regional plan to do this. So we'll send so-and-so as a delegate. That so-and-so is not empowered to become a new boss. And he's not empowered to say, oh, well, politics, we needed to do this. Sorry about that. If you don't like it, elect somebody else 4 years from now. A delegate is basically subservient to the people who elected him or her. And so when they're saying here, this means that the people who elected them can instantly revoke them. They don't have to wait till, something. They can just do it, right? If they've got computers set up and everything, they can do it in 1 minute. By those who have mandated them. In other words, the idea of delegates is that they're mandated to do something. Usually they're told to do a specific thing, or if they're left somewhat unmandated, that means that they're told, do what you think best and then check back with us. It doesn't mean
That's why they're delegated responsibilities.
That's right. So abolition of hierarchy and independent specializations. Hierarchy is an obvious thing there. The specializations, the independent is the key word there. It doesn't mean that some people might not be a scientist or a doctor or, a specialist in this or that. The point is that we don't want specializations that become independent, so that suddenly the scientists are in control just because they're scientists and they supposedly know better or something like that. So that, again, these are things that we want to aim at least, if not institute, conscious management and transformation of all the conditions of liberated life. Kind of a big survey. But again, the idea is you're not just voting on a few things. There's an ongoing process where everybody is involved in what kind of lives, what kind of society are we going to make for ourselves? And not just from here to tomorrow, but we keep on doing that. We don't just lay back and say, okay, now it's cool. We'll just elect this new government that will keep that going. And then find out that the new government is up to, no good in some way. Permanent creative mass participation. That's kind of the same way of saying the previous one. Like, in other words, that there aren't masses as opposed to a few leaders or specialists or even delegates or something like that. It's like everybody's taking part. It doesn't mean that everybody has to do the same thing or has to be participating 100% of the time. But that's the idea, that everybody is engaged. It's not, there's not a specialty like governing. International extension and coordination. In other words, if you've been doing these things, say for a region or for a country, that it's still not going to suffice until it's extended elsewhere. You can't just say, well, this country will do it, and then we'll deal with these other countries when we get to that. If this is going to survive, it has to spread to all these other countries. Otherwise, these other countries that are still under capitalists are going to bomb your country or something. So those are these factors, to look for in trying to figure out, what do we do now? And it doesn't matter too much what they're called. We call them workers' councils, but they could be called popular councils or popular assemblies or town meetings or any number of things. The point is that those qualities be there. And then I add a little later on here, a non-hierarchical society does not mean that everyone magically becomes equally talented or must participate equally in everything. It simply means that materially based and reinforced hierarchies have been eliminated. And that's italicized. In other words, hierarchies that are based on the fact that one person controls the food or the transportation or something, and somebody else doesn't. Although differences of abilities will undoubtedly diminish when everyone is encouraged to develop their fullest potentials, the point is that whatever differences remain will no longer be transformed into differences of wealth or power. Danny.
Well, you just deprived me of a pleasure I was anticipating. I was going to raise my hand in order to remark that I was particularly struck by this paragraph and I was looking forward to reading it out loud.
Oh,
That
you're
second
welcome to do it if you want to.
that second sentence, although differences of abilities will undoubtedly diminish when everyone is encouraged to develop their fullest potential. The point is that whatever differences remain will no longer be transformed into differences of wealth and power. I thought that was very, very clearly, very well put. And that really struck me.
Yeah, thank you. This is another paragraph that I will read that's sort of along the same lines. So, and this is again, people say, oh, so-and-so's an idiot. Are you going to say they're going to? Self-management does not require that everyone be geniuses, merely that most people not be total morons. It's the present system that makes unrealistic demands, pretending that the people it systematically imbecilizes are capable of judging between the programs of rival politicians or the advertising claims of rival commodities, or of engaging in such complex and consequential activities as raising a child or driving a car on a busy freeway. Just think about that. These are like, anybody is supposedly supposed to be capable of doing those complex things, and yet we don't think they're capable of deciding whether we're going to have food or not. With the supersession of all the political and economic pseudo issues that are now intentionally kept incomprehensible, most matters will turn out to be not all that complicated. When people first get a chance to run their own lives, they will undoubtedly make a lot of mistakes, but they will soon discover and correct them because, unlike hierarchs, they will have no interest in covering them up. Self-management does not guarantee that people will always make the right decisions, but any other form of social organization guarantees that someone else will make the decisions for them. And then we go on to war and crime. I'm not going to go into this the thing about war is pretty obvious, like almost all wars. Sid, did you have something to comment on? Unmute yourself.
I have to say that I'm thoroughly enjoying reading your book. And I think I think it's brilliant in many, many, many ways. And there are so many good points, almost too many um, to comment on, although the last ones that you and Danny wrote about were two of them that I loved. Before we get off the last section, sort of in general, my approach to this meeting, I wanted to say how much I enjoyed things is number one. And I could mention a few of the various things, but I'm sure other people will, and we'll get to them later. There's a few things that are, for me, either contradictory or confusing or bring questions up, which and
Yeah. I think you're,
comment is I think
oh, there you are. You froze
we
for a
still
minute.
online?
Yeah.
Still
Anyway, why don't
Yeah,
you
I think
mention
I
some of those
broke up.
things? We can,
No. What's that?
why don't you mention some of these things
Yeah,
you find
let me,
problematic?
yeah, right. Okay, so on page 94 of the section that we just spoke about, consensus majority rule and unavoidable hierarchies, down at the second part of the book, you talk about unstructured group. We talk about groups and
Right.
the tyranny of structuralness and structurallessness. So there's one thing, and this may be just a pedantic point, I'm not sure, but it talks about uh, it says, okay, as we pointed out in a well-known article many years ago, Joe Freeman's The Tyranny of Structuralness, there's no
Structurelessness.
structurelessness.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a structureless group. There are simply different types of structures, which seems, that seems pretty clear to me. And then you say an unstructured group generally ends up dominated by being a clique that does not have some efficient structure, which is also pretty clear, except the whole concept of an unstructured group seems to be contradictory to the previous notion of the fact that, structuralists.
Yeah, you have to take these things a little bit lightly, Sid, in the sense like uh she was when she wrote that thing, it was in the context of women's movement things at that time where they had uh so-called consciousness raising groups and different things of that nature, and we're really pushing the idea of having small, intimate discussions. And uh, those groups often presented themselves as being, oh, we don't have any structure. All that, none of that.
Which is
Maybe
kind
they
of
even thought that structure was a masculine thing or something. They were saying we're open here, and we're free flowing, and we're doing these kind of things. And
mhm.
Joe Freeman was pointing out from her experience in those groups that, in fact, she was saying, well, actually, any group has a structure. I mean, that notion that your
Right.
structurelessness is just a fantasy. But the point is that if you don't have an explicit structure, like are we going to vote on this, or are we going to, how do we organize this? Do we have a chairperson or whatever? If you don't have any of that, then there's a de facto structure of manipulators. Because some people, if there's literally no structure, they're just sort of gathering people. Certain people are going to be more skillful at kind of pretending to speak for the majority, or to,
Right.
pose
Right.
things that sound like, oh yeah, that's obvious, something. And there are people that can do that, and nobody even knows. They may not even know what their name is. They just, some people are more skilled at negotiating social situations. Just like when you go to a party, some people maneuver around to have a conversation easier than other people. So she's just saying for practical purposes, if something is unstructured, there are leaders in that group. She's saying, believe me, and you can usually, if you look closely, see who they are.
Yeah,
Even if they don't say I'm the leader.
So what do you think about, since we're all agreeing that there's no such thing as actually an unstructured group,
Right.
what do you think about putting the word unstructured in quotes?
Well, it's sort of de facto in quotes. I mean, in other words, if you follow either what I've written here, or if you follow her article, it becomes clear that she is saying these so-called unstructured groups.
Okay.
But these so-called unstructured groups actually can be tyrannies. Like that, there's a tyranny where you can't put your finger on anything. You can't call out anybody like you're disobeying the rulers because supposedly there's no rules.
Right.
They'll just laugh you out. Oh, we don't have any structures around here. And then they'll go back to listening to somebody who they sort of
pretty tricky
defer to.
Okay, thank you for that response.
Yeah, do you have any others?
Well, I have some others later on,
Oh, okay, if it comes in later, but do bring those up because that can be valuable.
Cool.
So moving on to the war thing, I think I just have a brief paragraph there to say pretty much we know most wars have economic causes, and even things that look like they have religious causes or whatever. A lot of times what's actually at stake is, different kinds of things that will not, as one of Bertrand Russell's nice essays when he's talking about war, and he was, of course, a pacifist, he pointed out, he says, war involves far more work, hardship, and risk than any form of constructive activity. I'm not quoting him, but I'm sort of paraphrasing him. People with real opportunities for fulfillment will have more interesting things to do. Like nobody really would want to go, what war is like? You're in the mud and trenches, you with lice and bombs on you and poison gas and whatever the different things are. Nobody would voluntarily go into something like that unless they were desperate, either because they have nothing else to do and they're forced to do it, like they're drafted, or in the rare cases, like in the Spanish Revolution, they feel they've actually got something to fight for. Okay, I'll risk my life to fight for this. So if we have a society like we're talking about here, people will have a lot more interesting things to do. H.G. Wells, or no, it was William James, the philosopher, had this thing which he called the moral equivalent of war. And what he meant by that is war, as it was, brings in all these kind of impulses and draws on them, exploits them. And so he sort of hypothetically said, we need to have other things that can draw that energy so that it doesn't go into war. Maybe it goes into ecological reconstruction, or, so that your enemy is pollution or your something, instead of just saying everybody should be nice or something, he's saying, well, suppose there is this aggressive thing in people. Well, let's harness that aggression so that we're, using it to fight stupid things. And then I go into a similar thing about crime. I'm not going to go into detail, but and I end up with this long footnote, which is a real gem um, about the what's called the what does he call it? The crime control industry and the correctional industrial complex. When you're talking about these things, you wonder why, we have more people in prison than any other country in the world. And why is that? Well, for one reason, do you know what the most powerful lobby in California is?
Prison guards.
That's right, the Prison Guards Union. It's more powerful than the oil lobbies and I mean anything you can think of, and so they get it in there and they were behind things like 3 strikes and you're out, that ends up in a lot more people being in jail and ends up in a lot more prison guards making 100,000 a year or more for doing nothing but being jerks, you know. So anyway, I want to you can read the chapter. I'm addressing like, okay, maybe some people would do bad things, but nothing anybody did could be as horrendous as what we're doing every day in our prison system. It's just like, making, I don't even want to go into it. It makes me nauseated to think about it. So the next chapter is abolishing money. And I go through and point out various ways that you could get around money, and what are the possible replacements of money, or what I call credits here. I mean, that I'm just adopting a term that other people have used. Like I said, there's sort of a three-tier thing. Certain basic goods and services will be freely available to everyone without any accounting whatsoever. So that's like a water fountain is like that. Nobody charges you for using it. It's just there. And then others will also be free, but only in limited rationed quantities. Like maybe you get free food, but you don't get free, some luxury. Yeah, there's something like if there's a scarcity element involved, then you sit down and you work it out. Oh, we don't have enough to go so that everybody can have everything that they totally want. If they would want, a ton of caviar or something, sorry, we don't have that. So we'll have to divvy it up, like each person gets a jar of caviar or something. Whatever it may be, or we have a lottery for it or something. And then others classified as luxuries will be available in exchange for credits. And here, again, I'm just sort of brainstorming here. The point is that if there are some things that, like an example of the first thing should be like everybody should be able to have a home that's a somewhat decent home, but at least a home, even if it's not very decent, that's an obvious thing. Like for starters, you as well as getting enough food and a few things like that. And then when you get to the more secondary thing, like, well, does everybody deserve a mansion? Well, that's probably too much, at least at this point. And as Judy was even saying, why does anybody even want, some of these things that we picture as what rich people do is because, it's kind of not necessarily what a sane individual would necessarily want to do if they're not trying to show off their wealth or something. Anyway, if there are things like that, like maybe there are certain areas that are nicer than other areas. Maybe it's more pleasant to live at the foot of a falls in Yosemite than it is to live in some desert area or something. I don't know. I'm just making this up. If you have things where who gets to live where or something, first of all, everybody gets a home. And then the next thing is figuring out, do we have more people that want to live in Yosemite than it can handle. And in that case, maybe we say only X number of people can be there at once, or whatever. The point is that people would decide then, rather than just say, oh, well, so-and-so gets to do that because he's a billionaire. Sid.
I think, yeah, I'm totally for abolishing money. And I think those three basic points, the three-tier economic setup is brilliant. And I'm totally in agreement that everybody should have a home. But the thing, this is another one of those places where I'm getting a little worried because it has to do with like where you speak about credits, and also on the next page, page 102. See, I made a note of this. Where there was a discussion of a person who had like a big property, and it seemed like they got to keep that property. Or this discussion that you just mentioned, where some people, where there's certain areas or places that are nicer than other places. So those are that's in some ways it's sort of like the crux of the matter. One of the things about credits that worries me is that, first of all, I don't really understand how that would work, because I mean, my fear is that it's leading into some other form of exchange. And later on in the book, you talk about exchange and gifts,
Yeah.
and speak about gifts as a form of exchange, which I totally disagree with. I think gifts are gifts, and exchange is basically the same as money, whether it be, wampum or whatever. So somewhere in, I think it might have been in the minimum definition or something, they talk about gifts, but gifts are something, well, that's like this whole other, conversation. But the whole question of credits, like, is that, you did say it's just sort of brainstorming and putting it out, but really, what does it mean? Like, who gives the credits? Who decide? What is a credit? Where do you get it?
Okay, let's just try to talk about it practically. Like, first of all, we're starting out talking about like if it was happening tomorrow. And then through whatever, miraculous thing, we've managed to, disarm the police, and so we're not having to worry about that kind of thing, which they had to worry about in the Spanish Revolution,
Right.
Frank's forces, all that. So, but nevertheless, it's not like we can instantly say that. Like if everybody in the Bay Area, let's just thought experiment.
Okay.
Okay, we're entering a new type of society here, and money is meaningless anymore. Don't wave around your $1 billion and think that means anything to us. It's hereby rendered nothing. So I'm just saying that the first thing might be on the agenda would be, there's people living out in the streets. As far as, let's look at housing.
Right.
Okay. First thing is get them so that they have some kind of halfway decent place. I mean, we're not going to be debating all these other things while they're still sitting in the street with their shopping carts and stuff, right? I mean,
Right.
that should have priority. Okay, so as it happens, as most of you probably know, there are more empty buildings in the United States than there are homeless people. So in other words, leaving aside what kind of buildings they are, whether they're offices or old warehouses or whatever, it's not as if we don't have buildings. It's just that a lot of them aren't being used.
Yeah.
And a lot of them, I mean, there are buildings that could house hundreds of people.
Yeah.
And they're just sitting there empty because the owner doesn't do anything with it,
Which is
and
insanity.
tax write-off or something, So that the first thing is that you sort of work from the bottom up, like, okay, everybody should have that. And with priority, like to, sick people and old people and feeble people, and leaving aside the homeless thing.
They'll be on the first floor.
Okay, so you've got that. So that's not talking about like moving anyone out of their house. So let's look at what that would be like. Okay, you've got somebody in a little hut that, like those little sort of miniature homeless things that people build. And then you have somebody else living in an actual mansion in like, the Berkeley Hills or something like that.
Mhm.
Very different. Okay. Like for starters, we're not even saying, no, that's illegal. You can't do, we're just saying, okay, that's your home for right now, but we're thinking about that. So while we're in this thinking about this process, the person who lives or the family who lives in that big mansion, as I said, they don't want to be everybody eyeing them like, why does that person deserve, so
Right.
if for no other reason than selfish reason, such a things might say, hey, we've got some spare rooms here. Come on in and we'll sort of temporarily do this until we figure out things. So in other words, that's like a temporary thing that is somewhat equalizing things.
Okay.
For example, if there's something like the Trump estate somewhere, I don't think it's I think it's a no-brainer that you would just say, get the fuck out of here. We are confiscating this. This is hereby requisitioned, Trump Towers or whatever, Mar-a-Lago and all that bullshit.
Hmm.
Nobody's going to say, oh, that's not fair. It's their home. They work to pay for it or something,
Right.
So anyway, that solves the emergency things. Then after, who knows, a few months, a few years, it's hard to say, depending on other factors, then you start saying, well, really, what right does this person have to be in that mansion? That's just because their parents had a lot of money or something. That doesn't,
Right.
And they got a swimming pool and a nice, all these other things. So at that point, little by little, you start probing into what do we do about these other things. So that means that maybe temporarily some wealthy people still are living better than non-wealthy people, just sort of by inertia. This is our home. But at least they are no longer owning a factory, which they're making money on, which they're spending to bribe congressmen, which they're spending to start a war, all this other bullshit. So, in other words, it's reduced a little bit more to just person to person. Like, we're not having money anymore. So why is it that you deserve to live here or something? Like I say, temporarily, maybe you just say, okay, we're not going around and, going into every house and saying it's illegal to have X number of square feet and blah, blah, blah. But as soon as things sort of settle a little bit, people will then say, well, what is the more reasonable way to do it? Like it is a nice house. It's got a great view. So do we share it out? Do we turn some of those things into public parks because of those nice views and nice orchards and yards that they have and all that? Yes, in some cases. Who knows? But the point is that in that case, my hypothetical thing, the people of the Bay Area all together are going to say, well, that let them live there for the moment. You know, we've got more pressing things to do. Or they can say, enough is enough already. Let's turn that into a park.
Mhm.
And you other people can find other places just like everyone else is having to do. You know, just like the homeless people are having to do and so on. So,
Yeah, it's pretty difficult to project so far into the future.
that's right. And remember, we have a few examples of what happened, and many of those examples were in Spain in 1936.
Mhm.
Under very unfavorable circumstances. They're trying to fight off the fascists, etc., and they're being stabbed in the back by the Stalinists. Even so, you had groups of people that, you know, whether they were peasants in the countryside or workers in Barcelona, who said, okay, now this is ours. Or they might have said this belongs to the CNT union, but if in effect, it's like saying this belongs to the workers. It belongs to the working people of Barcelona or whatever, you know, and a lot of the owners just actually fled the country for fear of being lynched or something. So, you know, in most cases, they didn't even have to deal with that. They just had to say, what are we going to do with this factory? And then they decide, oh, let's, instead of making blah, 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 let's make weapons because we desperately need them. Okay, we'll change the factory for that. And how are we going to work it? Well, maybe we'll still have some foremen or something, but they're not going to be bossing. You know, it's going to be people elected by the workers. If you need somebody to sort of coordinate what's going on, the workers are going to, no problem. Yeah, they'll elect somebody if somebody knows how to run the machine better. They're not going to elect somebody else that doesn't know how to run the machine. Anyway, they worked out stuff like that.
Yeah, I
They
remember.
were paid, in most cases, they were paid, either everyone was paid the same thing, or they were paid very nearly the same thing instead of having one guy getting 100 times what the other people do.
Mhm.
So it's just an example of that, you know, and
I seem
as I
to
say, when I get to the sort of the labor and then transforming work into play, you know, you get these things where at first you say, we need this building to be fixed up or something. Okay, volunteers, you know, blah, blah, blah. So then if you don't find enough volunteers, then you say, go out and ask for more, you know, say, hey, we really need this, or can you put in, you know, I know that in practice, in most situations, there's more than enough volunteers if it's a meaningful thing. I mean, you get people volunteering for, you know, Doctors Without Borders and stuff like that, who are going in miserable circumstances. They're getting very little pay. They risk getting diseases themselves in Africa or someplace, you know, and yet people go and do that. You know, so if they'll go and do that, it's just like, I mean, you know, people volunteer to help somebody fix up their home. And I mean, right now it might be a little more iffy, but if it's a question like, hey, let's all join together here and make some homes for these homeless people, or let's fix up this place so we can have a nice community center or something. You know,
Yeah,
people are
people
going to
do
do
that.
that kind of stuff. And then in a pinch, like again, speculate. Suppose there's some real dangerous thing that needs to be done. Okay, here's where I'm talking about credits. You say, okay, if you volunteer to go down in this mine and do, you know, this thing that needs to be done, but it's real icky and dangerous and strenuous or something like that, you get 100 credits. And then the 100 credits come in and they say, hey, who gets to live in Yosemite? It only costs 50 credits to live there for a year. I mean, I'm just making this up, but the point is, if there are things that you can't have just equally divvied around, then you do something like that.
Isn't that like money though?
Not really,
Okay.
because people that get money did not get money because they were heroes. They got money because they're people like Trump or something, you know.
It's
That's
kind of
the
like
first thing. I mean, what did these billionaires ever do?
no, but I'm saying is, not like that, but it's sort of like
Oh, well,
it's the
yeah,
hazard thing.
what it is, and I say in quotation marks, it's a temporary luxury. In other
Mhm.
words, it's something that right now everybody in the globe can't do it. You know, that's all.
Okay.
So given that, we don't say nobody gets to go to Yosemite. We just say, well, it's rationed. Uh, you know, and maybe you give more of the homeless people or something. Dave.
Maybe now is a good time to, for the few people who haven't heard it, to repeat the verse, the censored verse from "This Land Is Your Land."
Yeah.
I'm sure you know this, Kent, but I'll just do it. I'll just say it. I'm not going to try to sing. As I went walking, I saw a sign there, and on the sign it said private property. On the other side, it didn't say nothing. That sign was made for you and me.
Okay. Thank you. So anyway, when I get the transforming work into play, I quote that famous Tom Sawyer episode where he convinces everybody he's assigned by his aunt to paint a fence, and he convinces all of his buddies to paint the fence for him on the ground, you know, like, and once it's presented as a sort of exciting thing to do, they bribe him to let them do it, you know. And so my point is, again, the point that Tom Sawyer, in a momentary stroke of genius, came up with, says, if it's difficult and challenging, people will pay to do it. And you know, so Mike.
I just want, in addition to David's well said about Woody Guthrie's missing verse, that I remember the first time I ever heard that was at the anti-war demonstration in November of 1969 in Washington, where there were like 1 million people, and Arlo Guthrie got up and sang that song. And but at first, before he sang that song, he said, and I'm going to put the missing verse in.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, that's it.
Yeah, okay. So the next thing after these various things about work into play and so on, again, my point, the work into play is really important, because if we think in terms of, oh, work is drudgery and so people won't want to do it, yeah, it's drudgery now because most of it is bullshit. I mean, you're working to make a profit for somebody else, or et cetera. I don't have to give examples. But if you're doing stuff that's worthwhile to do, and you don't have to do very much of it because you've eliminated all the bullshit jobs, so that your sort of standard thing is like 5 or 10 hours a week per person, uh, and you get to choose which things you're doing, you know, like, oh, I like gardening. And if people who like gardening will say, oh, hell, I'll do 30 hours of gardening a week. What the hell, you know? So there will be more than enough. So there would be a few cases maybe that you wouldn't get volunteers, like just really, you know, I don't know, just something like maybe when you're building something, you're having to do, I don't know what. So that's where things like credits might enter in, where either you challenge people to volunteer because it's for the public good, you know, or it's will be very grateful to you or something, or you simply say people who volunteer for this thing over here that is reputed to be unpleasant get some credits, or else they don't have to work as much, or whatever, you know. It's just that people will figure out if something isn't getting done that needs to get done, they don't want to order people like you just have to do this or you go to jail or something, because we don't have any jails and etc. And we're not having money where somebody can accumulate $1 million by doing this and then start using that to exploit people. Because again, as the credits, I was saying, these are like time limited. They're not something that anybody could accumulate. So anyway, after we get past then, I have a chapter called Technophobic Objections, and I'm not going to say anything about that, because as you will see, our reading at our next meeting, there's a substantial text that deals specifically with this chapter, where some anarcho-primitivist criticized this chapter, and I replied to him. So we will go into all of those things, or you will have gone into them when you read them next time. So then we've got things about ecological issues and how might that be worked out, and so on. And then the blossoming of free communities is just a little more general, like not just making homes for everybody, but like creating new communities, as opposed to not necessarily cities exactly as we know them, because they might be merged into the countryside or something, but you might call them cities. Just say communities where people sort of tend to gather. And those could be of various different kinds. But the point is that unlike current cities or current places where people, like those mega cities or something where people are just living in shacks in huge slums, we could make cities or communities however we wanted them. And so that means that once we had sort of got everybody housed and some of those sort of basic things worked out, then we can look at the Bay Area and say, okay, we've got an unusually beautiful environment here, but not, and some of the housing is fine. Others are just sort of ugly buildings, or, we might decide that we want things organized in a different way. Maybe we want more parks, or we want parks in a different place, or we want, some kind of combination of organic gardening and parks, or I mean, any number of things that people may come up with. And I just speculate here a little bit, saying, for example, I mentioned Charles Fourier, the utopian socialist of the early 19th century, who was sort of notorious for his fanciful things based on passions, not based on need and, strictly economic stuff. And so he had all sorts of ideas about how people would relate with each other in different groupings overlapping, and people who were really into this would do that, and people who were into other things would do this thing over here. And then there would be alternate things so people wouldn't get bored. And, there would be combinations of music with working or something. And, just some of them kind of crazy, but, like the gist is that one reason that both the surrealists and the situationists liked Fourier a lot is that it had this notion, like, let's make a trip about this. Let's not treat it as begrudging work that needs to be done, although some work needs to be done. Let's make a society where the work itself, the so-called work, is like play. Or it's alternated around so that it's just a big trip every day, and you're living in a nonstop festival or whatever. Maybe everybody doesn't like festivals, and some people create communities that are real quiet and tranquil, where they're doing meditation all the time or something. My point is that all sorts of different things will be possible for people to create once we no longer have to create them for the dollar. you know, to create them because there's a factory here, and because the factory is here, we need highways to get people to the factory, and we need blah, blah, blah. So I just imagine all these sort of local assemblies will keep tallies of offers and requests, like people seeking something, just like online dating, you know, things like this. Make known decisions of other assemblies and the current state of projects in progress or problems yet unresolved. Inform the libraries, switchboards, and computer networks to gather and disseminate information of all kinds and to link up people with common tastes. Media will be accessible to everyone. I mean, we already get a little of this with the internet in a kind of limited way. Traditional arts and crafts will continue. It's not like the situation is critique of art. It doesn't mean that people don't still do things like that, but it just means that they're no longer a specialty like a career, you know, that a few people do it because they can make money off of it and everybody else just consumes it. Let's say, but merely as one facet of continuously creative lives. People will still take part with more zest than ever in sports and games, fairs and festivals, music and dance, lovemaking and child raising, building and remodeling, teaching and learning, camping and traveling. But new genres and arts of life will also develop that we can now hardly imagine. And then I get to the last chapter called More Interesting Problems. And I'm going to read a large part of this because in this one little, like it's less than 3 pages, I kind of cap off a lot of these things that we've been working towards and all these things that remain up in the air. An anti-hierarchical revolution will not solve all our problems. It will simply eliminate some of the anachronistic ones, freeing us to tackle more interesting problems. An anachronistic problem is people don't have enough food, even though there's more than enough food. They don't have a home, etc. So we've gotten over those things. Now, what problems remain? Well, things that are more worthy of people to deal with, rather than something stupid like a society where people don't even get enough to eat. If the present text seems to neglect the spiritual aspects of life, and spiritual in quotes, this is because I wanted to stress some basic material matters that are often overlooked. But these material matters are only the framework. A liberated society will be based far more on joy and love and spontaneous generosity than on rigid rules or egoistic calculations. We can probably get a more vivid sense of what it might be like from visionaries like Blake or Whitman than from pedantic debates about economic credits and recallable delegates. I suspect that once people's basic material needs are generously taken care of, and they are no longer subjected to a constant barrage of commercial titillation, most of them, after brief binges of overindulgence in things they were previously deprived of, will find the greatest satisfaction in relatively simple and uncluttered lifestyles. The erotic and gustatory, that's it, like eating, arts will undoubtedly be enriched in many ways, but simply as facets of full, rounded lives that also include a wide range of intellectual, aesthetic, and spiritual pursuits. Education, no longer limited to conditioning young people for a narrow role in an irrational economy, will become an enthusiastic lifelong activity. In addition to whatever formal educational institutions there may still be, people will have instant access via books and computers to information on any subject they wish to explore, and they'll be able to get hands-on experience in all sorts of arts and skills, or to seek out anyone for personal instruction or discussion. Like the ancient Greek philosophers debating in the public marketplace, or the medieval Chinese monks wandering the mountains in search of the most inspiring Zen master. The aspects of religion that now serve as mere psychological escapes from social alienation will fade away. But the basic questions that have found more or less distorted expression in religion will remain. There will still be pains and losses, tragedies and frustrations. People will still face sickness, old age, and death. And in the process of trying to figure out what, if anything, it all means and how to deal with it, some of them will rediscover what Aldous Huxley, in The Perennial Philosophy, refers to as the highest common factor of human consciousness. That's his term for mysticism, this sort of universal mysticism that's similar in Hinduism and Christianity and Buddhism and Taoism and so on. Others may cultivate exquisite aesthetic sensibilities, like the characters in Murasaki's Tale of Genji, or develop elaborate metacultural genres like the glass bead games in Hermann Hesse's novel, freed from the material limits that formerly confined such pursuits to narrow elites. I like to think that as these diverse pursuits are alternated, combined, and developed, there will be a general tendency toward the personal reintegration envisioned by Blake and toward the genuine I-thou relations envisioned by Martin Buber. A permanent spiritual revolution in which joyous communion does not preclude rich diversity and, quote, generous contention, unquote. That's from a Blake quote. Like contention that your partners and maybe even lovers with the person you're contending with. Leaves of Grass, Whitman's wishful thinking about the potentialities of the America of his day, perhaps comes as close as anything to conveying the expansive state of mind of such communities of fulfilled men and women, ecstatically working and playing, loving and loitering, strolling down the never-ending open road. That's capitalized open road after one of Whitman's great poems. With the proliferation of continually developing and mutating cultures, travel could once again become an unpredictable adventure. The traveler could, quote, see the cities and learn the ways of many different peoples, unquote, that's from the Odyssey, without the dangers and disappointments faced by the wanderers and explorers of the past. Drifting from scene to scene, from encounter to encounter, but occasionally stopping like those barely visible human figures in Chinese landscape paintings, just to gaze into the immensity, realizing that all our doings and sayings are just ripples on the surface of a vast, unfathomable universe. These are just a few hints. We are not limited to radical sources of inspiration. All sorts of creative spirits of the past have manifested or envisioned some of our almost unlimited possibilities. We can draw on any of them as long as we take care to extricate the relevant aspects from their original alienated context. The greatest works do not so much tell us something new as remind us of things we have forgotten. We all have intimations of what life can be like at its richest, memories from early childhood when experiences were still fresh and unrepressed, but also occasional later moments of love or camaraderie or enthusiastic creativity, times when we can't wait to get up in the morning to continue some project or simply to see what the new day will bring. Extrapolating from these moments probably gives the best idea of what the whole world could be like, a world as Whitman envisages it, and here I quote from Whitman, a world where men and women think lightly of the laws, where the slave seizes and the master of slaves seizes, where the populace rise at once against the never-ending audacity of elected persons, where children are taught to be laws to themselves and to depend on themselves, where equanimity is illustrated in affairs, where speculations on the soul are encouraged, where women walk in public processions in the streets the same as the men, where they enter the public assembly and take places the same as the men. The main shapes arise, shapes of democracy, capitalize, total result of centuries, shapes ever projecting other shapes, shapes of turbulent manly cities, shapes of the friends and home givers of the whole earth, shapes bracing the earth and braced with the whole earth. End of chapter, end of book. Comments or questions?
Ken,
Yes.
Ed Barcelona has a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay,
Do you want me to read them?
please.
First one is, Ken, what's your main critique of anarchists besides their frequent inability to arrive at practical decisions? Paragraph on page 95.
Right. And read the other one also.
Okay, the other one is also, as we're about to hit the 90th anniversary of the social revolution in Spain, I'm curious to know what's your take on the 4 Spanish anarchists that joined the government as ministers in 1936. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's notorious. I'll start with the second one first. Those 4, you know, they were allowed to go into the government by their unions, i.e. the CNT. So in a way, it's not just like to criticize those 4 for doing that, whether or not they should have done it or not. It's also somewhat of a critique of the Spanish anarchist movement to say, or maybe it's not, you know, but it's questionable. Like, was it a good idea for them to be in the government? And one of the anarchists who was in Spain, but he was an English anarchist, Vernon Richard, Vernon Richards, I believe his name is, who later married Marie-Louise Berneri, whose Utopia book we're going to read next year. He wrote a book called Lessons, I think Lessons from the Spanish Revolution or something like that. And his contention was sharply critical of those 4 people and of the decision of the anarchist movement generally, I mean, which had more than 1 million people, to agree to that or to allow that, you know, to sort of go along with it. And it's a complex thing. I don't want to say they were wrong exactly, but you can see that once they were in there, they became sort of like hostages to the government that included Stalinists and less radical socialists and sort of, you know, sort of middle of the road liberals or something, yeah, whatever, that kind of prevented some of the things that the anarchists were doing that were exemplary in Catalonia and Barcelona, etc., started getting impeded by that government. Because the government is then saying, no, those militias, like with Derrida, that's not official anymore. We need official government militias. And those official militias ended up being run by the Stalinists. And here these anarchists are in there sort of rubber stamping these. Anyway, it's a very dubious thing. So I don't have an easy answer. Like Emma Goldman disagreed with their being there. She said they shouldn't have been. She went to Spain right when this was happening. She said, this is not anarchism, you know, you're doing this. But on the other hand, you know, anarchism, like in anything else, when they were faced with realities, anarchists did things that were not strictly kosher. Like they voted in 1936 because, among other things, the Popular Front ticket said, if you vote us in, we're going to release all those Asturian miners who are in prison from the revolt 2 years ago. So that's a pretty good, okay, I'll compromise for that. I'm not going to be puristic and say, let them rot in prison, So anyway, they did that. And then they sort of found themselves in a Popular Front coalition. So again, as to what other criticisms I might have about anarchism, I mean, there's a whole range of them. I mean, I was an anarchist myself, and I sort of saw that if you are too fetishizing, not having leaders or not having rules or something like this, a lot of times it just ends up being a mess. Like merely declaring down with the state or let's have a free society. Yeah, that I mean, a practical liberal may be doing better than that. Even though you would say, oh, the practical liberals voting, they're so naive and they're voting for this or that, but they may have enough sense to know, well, if we're going to do this, we have to agree on such and such. We have to vote for it, or we have to look at the problems here. And often anarchist things don't do that. They just sort of split up into an infinity of different little groupings, accusing the other ones of selling out. So again, it's not anarchists or Marxists or whatever so much. It's like, as the Situationists put it, like you've got to be more specific. And when they wrote an article about modern day Spain one time, and they were writing about some people in Spain. And in order to describe the merits of those people, they said these people are have the good qualities, I'm paraphrasing, of Marx and Derrida. So Marx and then this anarchist guy, they don't have the bad qualities of Proudhon and Lenin. In other words, you've got an ostensible Marxist there, Lenin, and they're saying that's not where you want to go. You've got an ostensible anarchist called Proudhon, who actually was pretty reactionary in a lot of ways, male chauvinist, and I mean, he had a lot of things wrong with him. And yet you will see anarchists saying, oh yeah, Proudhon, Kropotkin, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, just because he's an anarchist, they're not looking at the they're not looking at the fact that Marx was much more radical than he was when Marx wrote a pamphlet critiquing that. On the other hand, Derrida was much more radical than Lenin. I mean, if you want, I mean, he's a leader of a militia. There's nothing about being nonviolent or anything like that. But he managed, that militia was really functional. Whereas the Stalinists were saying, oh, no, you need a regular army. These militias aren't going to do anything. Like, it was the most efficient militia. Because the people that, whatever. And it was an anarchist militia, but it included people like, that just people like Orwell and stuff like that, who weren't there. But Simone Weil, she was in the Derrida column briefly when she went there. Anyway, so that's enough to say about the anarchist things there. Thanks for bringing those up. Other comments or questions? Danny.
Well, the moment kind of passed. We jumped right into the chat questions, but I was just, I just wanted to acknowledge how beautifully the book ended and what a, and what a great, what a great book it is.
Thank you. Let's hear, John S., do you have any remarks? We haven't heard from you.
Yes, thank you very much. I mentioned the first time about how lucid I thought the writing was, and that continues throughout. And I especially like the optimism. It really is a lot of joy. So I wanted to read just a few passages, short ones, about the joy of reading, the joy of revolution.
Okay.
On page 120, you say, I suspect that once people's basic material needs are generously taken care of and they no longer are subjected to a constant barrage of commercial titillation, most of them, after brief binges of overindulgence in things they were previously denied of, will find the greatest satisfaction in relatively simple and uncluttered lifestyles. And I like how you acknowledge after brief binges of overindulgence
Yes,
in
I
things
mean,
they were previously
believe
denied.
me, homeless people or something, man, I don't care if they invade restaurants and eat tinned lobsters. Yeah, all the, I mean, this is completely understandable, but that's because it's a kind of perverted situation, like, of course they're going to do that.
Hmm. I thought that really shows an understanding of the psychology of human nature. And you're usually in these pages discussing history, political science, and economics, but adding this psychological element fortifies the whole. The saying arrives in parentheses, almost like a subconscious underpinning of the text. Then I also liked certain hard-hitting meanings with a lucid style converging in these sentences. Page 98. A convicted offender might be condemned to some sort of public service, not to intentionally unpleasant and demeaning shit work administered by petty sadists, which simply produces more anger and resentment, but to meaningful and potentially engaging projects that might introduce him to healthier interests, ecological restoration, for example. Page 99. I don't claim that there will be no problems, only that there will be far fewer problems than there are now when people who happen to find themselves at the bottom of an absurd social order are harshly punished for their crude efforts to escape, while those at the top loot the planet with impunity. Ain't that the truth? And page 103. A liberated society will have lots of this playful sort of work, personally chosen projects that will be so intensely engaging that people will no more think of keeping track of their labor time than they would of counting caresses during lovemaking or trying to economize on the length of a dance. And on page 108, I was able to understand why you invite your friends in January to a potluck party. Quote, a liberated society will probably function much like a potluck party. And finally, an anecdote. On page 103, I was happy to see mailman Ferdinand Cheval mentioned. I went in the early 1980s to see the Ideal Palace, and it reminded me of Angkor Wat in miniature. I asked the locals what their parents and grandparents had thought of Cheval and his palace made of stones collected on his mail route. They told me that everyone who knew him thought he was a complete madman. But since then, the village has embraced him because his palace brings in the tourists. I felt informed and chastised in one stroke. Cheval's palace reminded me of Simon Radia's Watts Tower because both are working class people building something from found materials. Incidentally, during the car ride in and out of the Ideal Palace village, I never saw a single stone. Cheval seems to have picked them all up. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, John. Let's see here. Kirsty, have you got any questions or comments?
Oh,
There
just
you go.
trying to unmute myself. Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, I really I have been enjoying reading this, although honestly, well, I like that this Oscar Wilde quote is in here because I find, although I like, as many people have mentioned, your optimism is really refreshing and in the, the current era in which it's so unlikely and rare. But yeah, so I like this Oscar Wilde quote about just to remind us that like what we're thinking of as human nature in our, overdeveloped Western societies and other societies is certainly going to change when conditions change greatly. But I mean, I do find, a lot of things that I think a lot of it, maybe if we're not gonna, we'll get to that in the coming week with you said you're going to talk about your piece with the anarcho-primitivist about the technological thing, because I had a lot of questions about that really. And I mean, and I'm not coming from this, technology bad, nature good thing because, I don't really separate them, but I did find it, I had to really think about even just the whole, I mean, it's a wonderful thought experiment, but to think about that there could be a revolution without too much destruction of basic infrastructure, just the question of, well, maybe the people in the Paris Commune could have lived with the talents and abilities of the people there, and if they were able to get supplies from the rest of France. But now it's almost like we're so embedded in this basic infrastructure that sort of has hierarchy embedded in it, like, both of people having to do these really pretty horrendous jobs in this country and even more so in other countries. And just wondering how is how can, well, I mean, once we have this worldwide revolution, I guess people will figure it out somehow. But the other thing was, connected with that, the environmental piece of like just wondering, and I think people have brought this up, as I recall, in some of the earlier meetings of like in the current era of our environmental crisis getting so bad, are we going to need are we going to be able to address it without some kind of overall structure? Or, I mean, is it going to, I mean, I don't think it's necessary, but it's certainly a danger that, people will feel that we need some kind of, at best, I mean,
No,
get out of
no,
the
for sure.
current mess of
We'll find out,
denialism we're
we'll
in.
find what we
Yeah.
need. But the
Yeah,
point is, we certainly don't need the kind of things we currently have, which are super hugely counterproductive. Yeah, if we're having something like organizing even some knowledge about, is some pollution happening here or is something happening here, is some part of it. Yes, we need a global thing for sure, absolutely. But the global thing should not be just like we're just hiring a boss and then the boss is deciding what to do. The global
right.
is like we have many competent people around. It's just that currently those competent people don't usually end up being in the government. I mean, especially in our current government, but even elsewhere, most of those competent people are sort of under the corporate thing, so they wouldn't even be in some like international organization unless they had kowtowed with billionaires and stuff. But if you have, I mean, humanity has thousands, maybe millions of people that are really sharp, on these ecological issues and health issues and all sorts of things like that. And the question is like that when everybody starts thinking we're in this all together and we've got to start working fast, we're way behind time on these things, we need to do this. A lot of things can be done pretty rapidly without necessarily hiring a dictator or something.
Right. Well, it's not so much hiring a dictator as I think it comes out in these other things about thinking, well, how would we, how do we run this credit system, or how would we decide? Decide, well, these people are in a mansion and they don't want to leave. What are we going to do about it, or something? But it's like ultimately, although I think all of us in this group would just, really love being, I mean, the idea of being in this kind of world is so wonderful. But then thinking of it's a diverse world out there, and there are all these other
Absolutely.
people
Yeah.
who are really thinking something else.
Yeah.
So
And
how do we deal with them?
Well,
is the
and I
question.
say, it is of course over optimistic to say we would have this global thing without too much stuff being destroyed. Like,
Yeah. No, it's
that's
a wonderful
unlikely,
thought
but the
experiment,
point
though.
is
Yeah.
that I did that because in this chapter, I didn't want to keep saying, well, meanwhile, we've got to fight off this fascist
Right.
militias that is invading us or something, so just for the sake of argument. But yeah, in practice, it's going to be different than we would imagine, and probably more messy and so on. So there may be things like where we simply can't deal with it, and where millions of people are simply dead because of some fuck up that some country makes, and then somebody else is, we don't know. It could be like some of these dystopian sci-fi things. But the point is that in situations like in Spain, they were fighting the fascists and also fighting the Nazis and Mussolini's support from the fascists, as well as the Stalinists, and yet they were doing some of this stuff. So people can do stuff under emergencies, and they can do it a lot better if they really think it's for us and not for the billionaires or something like that. So that's all we can do. And I'm just kind of laying these things out in a sort of oversimplified way so that you can see, like those credits kind of things, that's kind of a murky, ambiguous type of thing. That's just a marker to say, what do you do when everybody can't move to Yosemite? You have to do something where you you ration it, or yeah, you can't just magically create. If everybody wants this kind of thing, you can't make 6 billion of those things overnight. And in fact, you may decide that you don't want to because it's ecologically not good or something. Anyway, but you have to kind of juggle that with figuring out third world things or homeless people, this kind of thing, some sort of compensations, like bending over backwards to help those people, for example. But it doesn't mean, as I said, it doesn't mean that we in the wealthy countries would have to suddenly live impoverished or something. It just means that attention would be directed to helping the people at the bottom. And once that kind of got going, like in the Depression with the New Deal got going, you did have kind of some exciting things that happened then with some of those New Deal programs. And they started out being just desperate measures so that people wouldn't starve or something. But when we look back at that, some of them built up things that are still considered rather exemplary, and people were doing them, for very little money, and they were doing them together and under the auspices of a government, true, but the government was sort of in a position of saying, hey, we got to do something, folks. We're trying. And so here's Social Security, and here we've got unemployment insurance, and we've got all these things. So anyway, John Imp, unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Yeah, so just a quick comment that was stimulated by Kirsty talking. I just popped into my head that in terms of jobs and the boring jobs, so let's just take stocking shelves or something. I mean, we really have to think about the total impact that robotics is going to have, and the the impact that AI is going to have in the society as we go forward, and how those things will fit into this vision of, a better world. It kind of leads into what we're going to talk about next week with the reaction to technology.
Technology, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but actually, I think that a lot of those types of problems pretty much solve themselves, because the whole point is that these are technologies that can basically do all sorts of things. And to have them at the disposal of billionaires and insane politicians is one thing. But basically, like if you said stocking shelves or something, like for one thing, for a lot of stuff, there wouldn't be stuff to stock because a lot of bullshit simply wouldn't be produced anymore. But the kind of things that would be produced, if you have stuff that is sort of, I mean, what's wrong with stocking shelves? I mean, in the present society, every time something budges just a little bit, they say, "Oh, that's going to hit people's jobs." Well, good. If we're in a different kind of society, we want it to hit their jobs. We want their jobs to be eliminated if it's just some sort of rote thing.
Right.
So that's a good thing. Are you feeling sorry for people that can't fill shelves with stuff? I mean, if there's a robot that can do it, I mean, reasonably ecologically or whatever, great. Then people
Right.
don't have to break their backs doing
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That's
yeah,
what I'm saying, is that we'll start to eliminate, more of those boring jobs will be eliminated as we can expand the tech, as technology can take over
exactly.
efficiently. Let's get rid of those jobs and let's free up people.
Yeah, that's right. And then once people are freed up, things like AI or other computer kind of things, the point is who controls the technology. And if billionaires control it, guess what? We get what we've got now. But if people control it, they can decide, they're not going to be doing like some of these billionaires are doing, like, oh, let's just go gangbusters, and multiply this 1,000 times because it'll make a lot more money, and we don't know what it's going to lead to, but it'll. No sane people will do that. They'll say, okay, you have these AI programs or whatever it is. What do we want to use it for? Well, we use it for things like, okay, just like we use computers and search engines now, like use it for things like, oh, you can just press in a little thing and you can suddenly find this information. Great. That's okay. And then when you get to more dicey things like, can a computer write great music or something like that? Well, we'll see. But when people point out, well, a computer doesn't have emotions and blah, 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 so they can't write it, well, in that case, they won't replace humans. The thing they'll replace humans for is kind of rote things, like reading a whole text and finding all the typos in 1 minute, instead of hiring proofreaders to go through. But that's not going to, if you have things like style, or things like style of music, or things like the fun of playing music, that's not going to go away. I remember, I haven't done it much recently, but all my life I've played fiddle and guitar and just loved it. It's one of the joys of my life to get in there. And I love it, even though I can put on a recording of somebody that does it better. But there's still nothing like just doing it. It's just like making love instead of watching a picture of people making love or something, So for things like that, a computer is not going to replace that. It's just fun, it's just, it's like a dance. It's like, again, it's like dancing rather as opposed to watching people dance. It may be interesting to watch people dance, but
it's being alive.
Yeah. And so anyway, people can find out. I mean, maybe there will maybe some people who want to watch people dance all the time. Great, no problem. You know, but the point is that won't be because they're in a sick, separated society where they're just sort of used to being spectators and nothing else. It will be because they just choose that. Like, oh, and you know, those things can be fun too. There's nothing wrong with that. As I mentioned sort of elsewhere here, like when the situationists are criticizing the society of the spectacle, they're not saying it's bad to look at things or it's bad to present an image for people to look at or to read a poem to people or something like that. They're pointing out a tendency, just like when Marx is criticizing the commodities. It's not like he's criticizing commodities, the things, he's criticizing the commodification of products. That doesn't mean that people don't create good products and use them and are right to use them. And that's fine. You know, we need good food and we need, you know, there are other things that are joyous there. So it's the same thing with these technologies that now are sort of implicated in the spectacle separation, you know, like they made people keep people glued in front of their screen, and they're like with some of the AI things, they may be tending to create people who can't even write anything because they're used to just telling AI, write me something about this, and using that. I mean, that's obviously pretty pathetic, but that's only to be expected in the present society where you would do that because you can get a job by pretending that you wrote this thing, or you know, graduate from school pretending you wrote that paper or something. But in where those kind of interests are not there, then people can find their own level. And it may just be the fact that computers will have AI things on them will be, that's no more problem than the fact that you have a vacuum cleaner in your closet or something. That doesn't alienate you by taking away your, you know, you're using it there because it's more convenient to clean your house or something. So I think that these things will sort of sort out that way. So I think we can wind up there. I really appreciate the conversations we've had here, even though I'm monopolizing a lot of them, but the questions and interactions. And for the next 2 weeks, or next 2 sessions, we're now done with the Joy of Revolution. We'll have the so-called related texts, which are some texts that I've written since then. This was written like 30 years ago. And it will include some things about some French movements. And I mentioned that thing about the technology chapter of my sort of debate with this anarcho-primitivist, and some things about the Occupy movement. And then the second meeting will continue with the Occupy movement because there's a whole lot of that stuff. And we'll then segue into the Trump era with some things I wrote about that and about the COVID shutdown and so on. So I think those will be a little bit different, but they kind of, you know, they deal, especially the latter ones, deal with, okay, here we are. This is not an idyllic situation. And so anyway, I'll be sending out a short message, but the basic thing is that you're going to read about half of the remainder of the book. I think it's about 75 pages or something like that. And I'll specify exactly. And I'll hope to see you all 2 weeks from now for that next meeting. Thank you again very much.
Thanks,
Bye.
Ken.
Thanks.
And I will hereby
Thanks, Ken.
stop the recording. Let's see here. What is it? So we're now off record. If anybody else has any